But I just showed up like the next day at like the Muslim Student Center at Brown University, and I like knocked on the door, and the guy opened the door, and I was like, "Hi, I'm David, and I want to become a Muslim." And he was like a student from Malaysia he didn't have the best English, and he was like, "Okay." He was like, "Come on in." I think I said something like, "Where do I make the ablution?" It's like over here. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Robert David Coolidge. I go by my middle name, David, always have. And I was born in Chicago, Illinois. Grew up in northern suburbs of Illinois, Kenilworth, Illinois specifically. Converted to Islam in 1998. I'm married to a woman named Sumaya, who also grew up in Chicago. And we have 2 kids. And so I've been Muslim for 25 years now. We've been married for almost 20 years. And, I've done a lot of different things in the Muslim community over the years. I was a chaplain at Dartmouth College and Brown University and taught courses on Islam at different universities. Most recently, I moved to Oakland, California, so I could get my PhD at the Graduate Theological Union, where I specialized in Muslim understanding of the Hindu tradition, which in many respects came out of my chaplaincy experience and realizing that Muslims are so often involved in engagement with other religious traditions, but have generally neglected that long-standing 1,000-year history of Muslim engagement with the Hindu tradition. So that's what I try to focus on now, and involved in other things like Al-Kisah Foundation on the side. Well, I grew up in Kenilworth, Illinois, which is a small suburb north of Chicago. And we had 2 churches in our town. One was a non-denominational Protestant church, and one was an Episcopal church. Pretty typical American upbringing: baseball, hot dogs, all that. And going to church, which was just a couple blocks down the street, was a normal thing for us on Sundays. And I had a great childhood. I went to a K-8 school that was just down the street from my house. So everything was like walking distance or bike riding distance, and you kind of had this small town feel, even though surrounded by other suburbs, because this at one school for the whole town, about 3,000 people at max. And so all the kids in your grade, and you know everybody in town, go trick-or-treating in town and all that. And then you go to high school, and the high school is actually just a couple blocks past the K-8 school, but the high school was like a whole new world, right? It's at about 3,000 kids, drawing from a much wider, range. And so I think that's when most kids growing up in my town realize, there's a bigger world out there. Going to church was pretty normal for most people in my town on some level. There was 2 in my grade. There were 2 boys who were Jewish, and there was one girl who I found out later on was a Coptic Christian from Egypt. I knew she was Egyptian, but I didn't know anything else, but I figured out later on that she was Coptic. And, but it was just kind of a normal thing, and it wasn't something that anybody was particularly like super gung-ho about. It was just normal. It was just kind of in the background. For myself, though, it was a little bit different, because in junior high we had to go through confirmation class at the church that I went to. So the theology behind it is you get baptized as a kid, like a little baby basically, and then confirmation is like when you kind of seal the deal. You say, "I am a Christian," and you do these series of classes, and then you get up in front of everybody and actually recite the creed, like one of the basic creeds, like the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed. I'm pretty sure it was the Apostles' Creed, but I'm not 100% sure. And I went through the whole process, but when we got to the part of saying the creed, I felt very uncomfortable about it. And I had a conversation with my parents and with my minister about it, and decided not to get confirmed. And I was the only one in my confirmation class that did that. And, I sometimes explain to people that's how I understand qadr, right? I don't know why I was uncomfortable by it. Like just once they gave me the statement and I had read through it, even though I'd always gone to church, I just was like, I'm not comfortable like enunciating, declaring this in front of people that this is what I believe. I have questions about this. And that's where I feel like Qadr just came in and just prevented me. Like there's that famous story of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that like maybe he was going to go to this wedding, and they say that like he ended up falling asleep, and then the wedding ended up getting out of control, and it was sort of like one of those ways in which Allah protected him from like being in some unseemly gathering or something like that. And so for me, it's like I said, I just went to church all the time and it was normal. But then at this moment when it was like I would actually declare like, I believe that Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father, right, and will come to judge the living and the dead or something like that. I was like, no, I can't say this. And so I ended up not getting confirmed. And then it wasn't until freshman year in high school when I started becoming interested in religion on a different level. Well, my pastor had gone to a Union Theological Seminary, which was one of the sort of the most academic, liberal Protestant seminaries. And I think he had written his PhD thesis on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is this famous German Lutheran pastor. And, he was more intellectual, you could say, than your average Protestant pastor. And I think he appreciated the fact that I, was thinking deeply about what it meant. Kind of in terms of like over my lifetime, when my parents, would mention him, I think he thought that maybe I'd probably come back around, that culturally, like I was a Protestant, and Protestants sometimes can tend to think, well, we're on top of the world, like we created the modern world. And so, like, eventually, like, if he wants religion, he'll come back to, this most advanced form of religion.
What's the worst that could happen? He's not going to become Muslim.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't like, well, I'm thinking about going to Mecca. I think at some point later on, my parents may have joked something like, well, if we had known you were going to become a Muslim, we would have forced you to get confirmed. So, yeah, I think for my parents, they saw me as being a leader, right? That I was kind of like independent-minded, and I was like, I'm not just going to go along with the crowd. And but I don't think they saw it as like becoming really interested in religion even. It wasn't actually, like I said, until a year or two later that I became more interested in religion as such. My high school freshman year history class went on a field trip to a Hindu temple and a Buddhist temple as part of our world history section where we were talking about Eastern religious traditions. And so I was just totally fascinated by that experience. And at both places I bought books and, wanted to kind of figure out what it was that I was witnessing. It was so different than anything I had experienced at that point. I would say that throughout high school, the dominant way in which I approached religion was fascination. I played sports and I skateboarded and I was in bands and did all these other things, and I just liked studying religion. I thought it was really fascinating. And so I would read books, I would go visit places, I would watch movies about religion, just anything. I would go on websites to like learn about. I remember there was this University of Virginia like sociology of religion webpage that had like kind of like information about like all these different new religious movements or cults or whatever you want to call them, like, and I would just read them, and I just thought them so fascinating because it would be like, who was the founder and what was the principles and how many people were involved and what sort of scandals happened, and and so I just anything I could get my hands on, and I wouldn't talk to people who are religious. I'd just be like, oh, you're like a Christian? Tell me why you're a Christian. Like, oh, you're a Hindu? Like, tell me why you're a Hindu. What's that all about? Like, so I think, so that was like in and of itself, it was like an end in and of itself, right? It was enjoyable to study, just the way that someone else finds like American history enjoyable or Chinese language or whatever. But for me then, it became obvious that the kind of central theme of religion is like the meaning of all things, right? It's like, what does our existence mean? What does the planet Earth mean? What does biological life mean? What does death mean? what does growth and strength and decay mean, and all these things. And so I think it forced me to think deeply about, well, do I believe that there's like an overall meaning? But it was never a sense of like, the world is an awful place, or I'm going through these great difficulties and I need to find refuge in it. It was more like, this is so fascinating in of itself, but it forces me to think deeply about, like, as much as I enjoy life, like, life's gonna end. So like, maybe try and figure out what it means before you get to the end, kind of thing.
How old were you when this was taking place?
That was all through high school.
High school.
So I went to my local high school for 1 year, and then I went to a boarding school in Massachusetts. And the boarding school in Massachusetts had like a philosophy and religion department, so I was also able to take courses, and so I just kind of kept that up as one of my main interests, in addition to like playing basketball and skateboarding and all that. And so when I got to college, I knew I wanted to be like a religious studies major. I also thought about computer science, but that was too hard for me. So I always respect anybody who gets a degree in computer science, because I couldn't do it. So with Islam as a tradition, even though like I knew it existed, and there were kind of different interesting stories I could tell about that, but the real kind of clinching point was the summer before college. So I was part of like the Chicago area punk rock community, broadly understood, and I knew these guys who had converted to Islam from before. And so I was home, from my boarding school, and I was about to start another school on the East Coast. I grew up in Chicago, like I said, and so I was just like, hey, why'd you guys convert to this religion? And we ended up like having dinner together, and I asked them all these questions, and they were like, you should come with us to this Islamic bookstore. So I went to this bookstore called Iqra on Devon Street in Chicago, which is like the Indian-Pakistani street in Chicago. And they just took me around and said, here, get this book and get that book, and take this Quran. And so I went home and I read like all those books like within a week. And that was also the summer I read the autobiography of Malcolm X and the Quran. And so it was the first time that I had studied a religion, from a kind of more personal basis, as opposed to just, I had taken a course on like, Western religious traditions when I was in boarding school. But from at this point, it was the first time like when I studied something and I was like, okay, I can sort of see how that works. I think with other traditions, I was like, yeah, I don't think so, but it's still beautiful and interesting and fascinating. Whereas with Islam, it was like, oh, okay, maybe this one could work. But it was like, I'm about to start college, no rush. I'll keep taking classes on Islam when I get to college. Well, I think going back to what I said about the creed, I was always concerned about theology, right? Because theology is where your religion tries to explain why it is the meaning of life. And I think that with Islam, that initial phase, as it's so long ago, almost more than 25 years at this point, but the way I remember it is that the story was quite clear, and it was a global story, right? God creates human beings on the planet Earth. They're scattered all about. God sends all these messengers, some you know about and some you don't, to just tell them, hey, listen, you're going to die, so live a good life. I'm real. And, everything will be fine at the end if you just listen to me. And the Quran is not like the only book, it's just the most recent. And the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace and blessings be upon him and his family, is not the only one. He's just the last and the one who's really global for your time and your place. And so I remember we used to go to this vegan, like all-night vegan breakfast place in Chicago, like the punk rock kids. And, we would discuss Islam and Baha'ism, actually, because the Baha'i temple is like right near where we grew up in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And I remember having a discussion with somebody about Like, why doesn't the Quran say that, like, oh, there's also this place called North America, and there's these people called Native Americans who, like, we've also sent messengers to. So just like 1,000 years from now, when you discover North America, like, remember that I said this here in Arabic. And I remember, like, after having that conversation with some friends, because at that point I was not Muslim, right? I was just trying to think through it. I was like, that was kind of nitpicky, because the Quran does say that it, like, he sends messengers to all people, and it's very, like, non-committal about historical details. Like, you don't really need to know when and where this happened. Like, just, it happened sometime in the distant past. I'm kind of bringing my Christian, obsession about historical details from, like, the Bible, to that, because the Bible will just be like, and then, this guy had this son and in this place and did this thing and said this thing. And so it sort of sets up this idea you have to know the historical details. Whereas, like, the Quran is like, you don't really need to know. You just need to know that God sends messengers to all people live and die, and all people are morally accountable. And so, like, don't worry about it. So if you've heard the message for yourself, you got to figure out what it means for you. But don't worry about, like, what was happening, to Native Americans in the year 700. Like, you just trust, based on the Quranic message, that there was a messenger for them, and they were, guided in their own way. And so I think that helped me, overcome kind of certain types of doubts about religion that have their own specific historical and cultural location, right? Growing up in, like, a predominantly Christian country, and growing up with a certain narrative of secularism that is really written against Protestant Christianity in America. And one of those things being, like, historical details, right? And so because the Bible is so historically specific, the sort of secular narrative wants to say, well, this is why the Bible's wrong, because it doesn't have these historical details accurately. And then you kind of, okay, that's really, really important. And then you come to the Quran, you start thinking that way, and then you realize, wait a second, that's not even the sort of worldview that the Quran is opening up. The worldview that the Quran is opening up is this, tale of, these paradigmatic stories which mean something because they're paradigmatic, and because they help you to understand, like, what would you do in that sort of situation? Like, would you be on the side of Musa and Harun, may peace be upon both of them, or would you be like, no, I want to be with the mela, the elite, And so as an American, right, as a white person, as a male, someone who went to the same boarding school as both Bush presidents, when you're reading that story, you're like, wait a second, like, this story is about me, actually. The Quran doesn't even want you to think about when and where exactly it happened in the 3,000 years of pharaonic history. Just, there was one time when Musa and Harun went to whoever the pharaoh was at that time, and he confronted them. This is what went down. And so, at that point, I always describe it like the Quran was in my head, and it was, like, implanting different ways of looking at things, and it was answering my objections. And I've written about this, and I've said this many times, but I feel like that was the core of why I became Muslim, and that remains the core of why I'm Muslim to this day. That the idea that this book that comes from the 7th century in Arabic, and I was reading in English at the time, not with wudu. I didn't make ghusl and put on white clothing and face the qibla before I read the Quran. I was just had my all English translation. I was grappling with it, and through those meanings, Allah was, like, rewiring my worldview, and saying, and I think that there are other things that came later. So it's, I don't have, like, a perfect historical biographical understanding of myself, like. So I don't think this was necessarily in my mind at the time, but pretty soon thereafter. Like, the idea that, like, you were already dead once, and now you're alive. Like, you came from nothing. You didn't will yourself into being. You didn't make your own bones. You didn't choose your parents, and now you exist. And so, like, at the end of Surah Yasin, for example, when it says, like, who's going to recreate these bones once they become, dust? This is the one who made them in the first place. Like, why are you so high and mighty? Like, you were dead for 14 billion years. You كَيْفَ تَكْفَرُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَكُنْتُمْ أَمْوَاتٍ. How can you disbelieve in Allah when you were dead, and then He gave you life? And He'll cause you to have death again, and then He'll give you life a second time. So the claim, as I call this, I think of this as Quranic naturalism. The claim is that you can live a second time because you already know what it's like to come from nothingness. Like, I was nothing. This entire thing was nothing. It didn't exist in 1977. It only emerged into the world in November 1978, And Allah created my fingertips, as it says in the Quran. And so these were thoughts that I had before, right? And so this idea of like the Quranic intervention in human intellectual history is really, really meaningful for me because I feel like I literally experienced it. I was just this American kid who was like, I'll read anything. I'll read Bhagavad Gita. I'll read the Bible. I'll read your weird cult pamphlet. Seriously, maybe you're weird. Yahweh ben Yahweh, this weird, cult leader. Sure, why not? Because I find it interesting. But if it captures me, that's when it's going to be meaningful. And so when the Quran was like just literally challenging me on all these levels, I think that was when it really shifted. So, I had been exposed to it, and I was grappling with it, and I was grappling with other things. And to make a long story short, in the summer before my sophomore year, I was a counselor at a summer camp that I had gone to for a number of years, and me and another guy took 8 boys on a 2-week trip into the wilderness of Quebec. And I had my little Quran with me, and I would go to, the closest I ever felt to like meaning was like in nature. And this is why, one of the reasons I went to this camp, and why I would go back and do this sort of thing. And you see people the first couple of days, but afterwards for like 10 days, you don't see anybody. And you're just out in the wilderness. And so I brought this little Quran with me, all English. And at the end of the day, because this was kind of their culminating experience, they're 16 years old, you can kind of rely on them. You'd basically let the kids set up the camp. So we'd come into camp and like, all right, do your thing. We're going to take a break. So I had these Canadian cigarettes. I go to smoke a cigarette, like, away from the kids. And I pull out this Quran for like, 20 minutes or something. And I look at this, the sky and the river and the trees, and I read the Quran, and I'd just be like this. Like, this is like in tune with each other, right? At the time, I didn't know the idea that ayat, the signs of nature, is also the same word as like the verses of the Quran, right? But that's what I was experiencing, Senurihim ayatina, right? We will show them our signs. And so I was just like, this feels so in sync. And I think whenever I would read other religious texts in the past, I'd be like, it's really interesting, but it doesn't really hit me on that kind of visceral, organic, naturalist level, right? It feels very much like more the product of civilization, the product of the human mind who's grappling. Like the Bhagavad Gita is very much like that. It's very philosophical, and it's very like in response to all these different philosophical trends. But Quran just felt like really just raw in terms of that impact of this sort of signs of God in the world and in the book. And so I decided that I was like, I think I'm going to become a Muslim, but I didn't really know Muslims like sociologically. So I knew that one thing I knew was that they didn't eat pork. And so in the morning, we would fry up Spam on a griddle over a fire, like wood fire. And it was like, and it sounds gross, but like Spam in the wilderness is like one of the most amazing things you've ever eaten. Astaghfirullah. And so, but every morning I started trading it away to the kids. The night before we'd bake like a bread in a reflector oven. You just like make dough, and then you put it in this oven next to the fire, and the reflection of the heat bakes it. And so we'd cut up the bread pieces in the morning. So I started trading my Spam for an extra bread piece, which is a no-brainer for most kids on this trip. And so about like day 3, they're like, why do you keep doing this? And I was like, this is going to sound kind of weird, but I think I want to be a Muslim, and Muslims don't eat pork. And they're like, oh, cool, that's awesome. And they're like, what's a Muslim? And I was like, here's the Quran. I was like, they say it's from God, and there's this guy Muhammad. I mean, like, you have to imagine it's like 10 white kids in like the wilderness, like talking about Quran and Muhammad. SubhanAllah. So weird to think about. Anyways. So yeah, so like I just had this moment where I was just like, yeah, I think I want to be Muslim. But like coming out of that, you kind of get back into like civilization, and you went back to college, and my friend came out to visit before we went back to school, and we like went and partied and stuff, and just kind of I had this kind of like intention, this kind of spiritual moment, but I couldn't really like get there. And so I took a class with a very famous academic named Muhammad Qasim Zaman. It's now at Princeton University, and it was called Islam, Nationalism, and Fundamentalism. And it happened to be the class where a very famous Sunni Muslim, Hind Makki, was in that class. And then also I met my wife in this class. So we were reading for the class, and it was all about 20th century like Islamism, like the group in Algeria who won the elections and had the elections overturned, Khomeini, Sayyid Qutb, and the Ikhwan in Egypt. That was kind of like the whole theme of the class, and so we were just reading all this stuff. And so I was reading for the class one night, and I had been thinking about it, obviously, but I was like, I don't really know like what I want. I feel like, that moment in the wilderness was very distant, but I'm reading one night for the class. I always describe it, I was just like, it was like I had been standing on a line, and like Islam was on the other side of the line, and I'd been looking at it and like admiring it. And then I sort of felt like, Allah, just like a wind came at my back, and kind of, I stumbled forward, and I found myself on the other side of the line. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'm a Muslim. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And so I was like, I was a Muslim in that night. Like I just was like, I'm not thinking about it anymore. I believe, I'm comfortable with this. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. So I was like, okay, what do I do? So then I just called, or I don't know what I did. I maybe looked up on the campus map or something where the Muslim Student Center was, or called them up, or sent an email. I don't really remember. But I just showed up like the next day at like the Muslim Student Center at Brown University, and I like knocked on the door, and the guy opened the door, and I was like, "Hi, I'm David, and I want to become a Muslim." And he was a student from Malaysia he didn't have the best English, and he was like, "Okay." He was like, "Come on in." I think I said something like, "Where do I make the ablution?" It's like, over here. And that's how it started. And like I went to the first like MSA meeting like a couple of days later, and a friend who I still have a friend, she lives in Brentwood. We went to her wedding out here when she married this guy from Oakland, and ever since we moved out here, our families are really close. She was there that first night, and she thought I was an evangelical Christian who was trying to infiltrate the MSA. It's like, who's this random white guy who was just like, yeah, like Islam. But yeah, so, that's how I became Muslim. It was just, I think, obviously there was different like inflection points, but I think that kind of that initial comfort that came in the wilderness, like away from anything Islamic. There were no mosques, there were no Muslims, there was no Arabic. It was just me and my Quran, my all English Quran, and the wilderness. It was just like the purity of it. And then that just, I think that's another kind of like Qadri type moment that night where I just was reading, and I just felt like, okay, I guess I am a Muslim. It wasn't like I have to be a Muslim, I am a Muslim. And I'll sort of figure it out as I go along. 25 years later. Still trying to figure it out.
How did your parents take it? So, family, you come in, suddenly you say, hey, I decided to go Muslim.
they were like really freaked. So I called them on the phone. It was the next day or the day after, and I was like, all right, I just got to tell them. Because, they knew I was interested in religion. So, but they didn't understand that I was just kind of like in the mix, willing to like learn about, go do all these different things. Like, I had never had this sense that I'm like committed to anything, I'm just exploring it. It's kind of, some people I think in other parts of the world, they don't really have that opportunity. You know what I mean? It's not like a normal thing. But for me, I don't know, it's because of my personality, because I'm white in America, like you just sort of feel like you just show up at some person's house of, worship and be like, hey, tell me about your religion. It's like if somebody just came into Seva right now. They're like, so you guys are Muslims? Tell me about that. So like, I think my parents didn't quite understand that like my just kind of exploring was just me exploring. It wasn't like I was committed to any particular path. But now I was like, I'm going to be a Muslim. Like, this is my thing. And this is the truth, And so I just called them and I just told them that. And they kind of freaked out. And I think they just had nothing, they didn't know what to expect. They were like, I remember them saying things like, we don't know any Muslims. I remember my dad said something like towards the end, it was like, okay, well, we can't keep you from going to the mosque, but just don't screw your life up. Like, maybe they thought, like, is my kid going to, like, run away to Saudi Arabia? Like, I don't...
This was pre-9/11?
Yes. This is the fall of 1998. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, they had some of the negative impressions. But I think it was, I was at school, so, they figure, okay, it's something I can do at school. And I think if I had said something like, I'm going to drop out of school and join a Sufi order.
You were wearing maybe a white dish everywhere. So.
No. So, like, I definitely, I was psyched about that kind of thing, like, but I definitely was strategic about it. And so I remember, like, the first time I went home after that, like, I wore, like, a blazer and, like, like nice jeans and, penny loafers. I was like, because I know when I dress, that my mom will like it, that I'm wearing. She sees this video that I'm wearing polo. Hi, Mom. And so, I was just strategic about those sort of things. And then pretty quickly on, I also then realized, like, I've got to, like, be able to sift out what's primary from secondary. And so even though I'm psyched about, like, wearing a kufi, like a thobe, when and where appropriate, like, I probably shouldn't wear it in front of my parents because it's not like I have to, but I have to still pray, like if it's time to pray when I'm with my parents and things like that. So, and I think that whole process took years, to kind of like work itself out, just different elements of it. But I think that, overall they've been great about it and very understanding. And, they've only ever really kind of forbade me twice from doing something where they were just like, we really don't want you to do that. And, those were both things that were like mustahab. And so I remember I discovered in, Greater Sins by Dastaghem Shirazi, like the actual passage where it says, like, even your non-Muslim parents can forbid you from something mustahab if they really feel strongly about it. And I actually sent it to my mother. This is after they'd done it the first time. And so I actually found a thing in a Muslim book that says you had the right to do that. And they did it again later. And but I felt obliged to remind them. I said, remember, Mom, you do have the right to. I'm going to ask you for your blessing in this thing I want to do, but you do have the right to put your foot down on this one. So they did. And that's part of worshiping Allah, right? Like that, your parents have this huge right over you. And I to be honest, I'm deeply grateful, to Islam for teaching me that. I think it made me so much more appreciative, of my parents, because it sort of says, in a certain respect, that, your obedience to them is your obedience to Allah, And that's a really powerful idea. I know one that a lot of kids that grow up in American Muslim families don't really appreciate so much, but for me it was actually a good corrective to my American individualism. I'm going to do my own thing kind of ethos. No, they saw it pretty quick, because a couple tense moments I kind of was like, okay, am I being a better son overall? And they're like, yes, you're being great. And I was like, okay, then, as long as I'm doing my job, as a Muslim, like I'm doing, Islam in good faith by being a better son, then, you can push back. I understand this is hard for you. So, I really think that Islam actually made me want to like make my parents happy. Like that became a really important thing for me, and because you see Allah's qadr for you in them, right? That Allah chose that these would be my parents, and you want, your sense of happiness in the next life is that, hopefully we'll all be together. So I think that, I was in college and I was doing it because I had come to a point where I really believed in the core idea of it, but I don't think I was ready for the discipline. And I don't think I even really wanted the discipline, And I think that, that was, in so many different ways, that was by far the hardest thing. It was like, okay, I really believe God is real, but in order to manifest that, I have to do what I believe God wants me to do. And that's what taqwa is. And so what does that mean? Well, I can't drink. I can't smoke weed. I had a girlfriend, and that we figured that out pretty quickly. Just other things like that just, it's like it's slamming on the brakes. You know what I mean? And, I think there's a certain kind of like zealousness that you get sometimes, like some converts. It's like, I remember I had this one friend, actually one of the guys from the punk rock community who had become Muslim before me. He said something like, every convert gets like 6 months of like zeal that Allah gives them, to make it through the initial problem, but then they kind of have to come back to the real world. So he had already told me that. So I was kind of in my mind, I was like, when I was feeling that power, kind of himma, that kind of aspiration, I was kind of riding with it, but I had in the back of my mind, I was like, well, I got to be aware that there might be these moments where I kind of start to slip and fall. And so I think, all of the rest of college, that was my sophomore year. I think all of the rest of college was like it was a struggle, with all of those things. And to try and figure out like, how can I make certain things like long-term, and kind of more natural and like ingrained in my, my being. So like my junior year, I picked two guys who were in the grade below me from the MSA, because that would like, but I was friends with them, but by going into the housing lottery with me, they would get like a better spot. So I was like, I want to live with you guys so you guys can teach me about how to live like Islam on a day-to-day basis, like just the kind of in and outs of like daily life. And then like, you'll get a better like, better living setup. We're friends to this day, alhamdulillah. Like that was a really smart choice on my part, because like there was a lot of stuff that it's like you don't read it in a book. You just experience it in the morning at like Fajr time, and you're like, it's different. And I don't know, it just sort of, that was my sort of sociological introduction to like daily Muslim life. And, it's a funny story, but I'll tell it anyways. Like I was like, why you guys keep bringing Gatorade bottles into the bathroom with you? They're like, oh, you don't know about lotas? I don't know what they call them in non-Urdu languages, but they're, the water that you wash yourself with. And And they were like, yeah, this is what you got to do. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that. I was like, how does it work? And they're like, I don't know, you just do it. And I was like, and I kept coming back to them with more questions. Like, I'm not sure I'm doing it right. Like, is a Gatorade bottle really the best thing? Well, at our house, we've got these like flower pot waters, and those are easier. And I was like, we should get those. So I went to at some point, like the halal store. I think we had like one halal store in Providence, Rhode Island at that time. It was right next to the masjid, and they had a couple other things, and they had like this like red plastic lota, like with a little pouring spout and everything. I still have that lota. There's a lot of barakah in that piece of plastic. 24 years of worshiping Allah. So, but like if I hadn't lived with them, how long would I have gone without knowing that was an important thing to do? You know what I mean? And who would have I gone to find that out? So I think that, and there was just incremental things. It's you got to do something, so you do it, and that's when you learn about tawbah, right? Because you're like, I'm gonna do this. I'm got all this zeal, and then you fall down, and you fall flat on your face, and you're like, as a new Muslim, and this is a really important thing for all you kids out there watching who are new Muslims, you feel like you're not really a Muslim. You're like, I did what a Muslim is not supposed to do, and then you feel terrible about yourself, and then you feel like your faith is somehow illegitimate. Alhamdulillah, at some point you realize that's what tawbah is. Tawbah is when you fall flat on your face, you realize, well, God is still real, and God doesn't need my worship, and God doesn't need my righteousness, and God doesn't need anything from me, right? He's asked me to do these things for my own benefit. And he can wait. He waited around till I was 20 years old to even start trying. So why is he going to give up on, now that I'm trying, why is he going to give up on me because I keep making the same mistake for 5 or 6 years or however long it takes, to actually do it. And I think that, fortunately, alhamdulillah, at my university, I had a very supportive Muslim students group. And, there's a lot of kind of there wasn't, people sometimes say, oh, I became Muslim and the community was judgmental. I didn't have that at all. My local masjid and my imam, who was my first teacher, Imam Abdul Hamid, rahmatullahi alayh, may Allah have mercy on him, my MSA and my friends, I think they were all kind of supportive of this idea. Well, okay, you made a mistake, but you're still welcome. Keep coming, right? The only way you really lose is if you stop coming and you give up on yourself and you give up on the idea that you can actually be a person whose tawbah sticks and actually make that change. And I remember later on, this was maybe a year or two after I graduated college, I remember this well-known sheikh from Chicago. I went to talk to him because I was needing some spiritual advice. And I don't remember all the things he told me, but the one thing that really stuck is he said, it's not how far you get, it's about how far you've come. And he was saying this in the context of coming from a kind of Deobandi background where everybody's a Hafiz al-Quran and everybody studied Sahih Sitta and everybody does 20 rakahs of Taraweeh every Shahr Ramadan and all these things. And I'm just trying to make the basics stick and really feel like I'm solid. I have a solid foundation in my spirituality. And he was like, it's cool, man. You didn't grow up with any of this stuff. So yeah, if a kid just was taught Quran by the age of 10 before they could even choose, then maybe a little bit more is expected of that kid. But you've come so far already, so don't discount that. And I think that was a super duper important lesson to have somebody who's got the big beard and is really revered by the people in his community to say that. It made it seem more real than me just telling myself that I can keep falling down and keep getting back up again. That had so many stages. I had a really powerful experience early on. I've been Muslim for 5 years, I think. And just a long backstory, but basically I just made this kind of general tawbah for everything I had like done wrong. And I was just like, Ya Allah, like I feel like I've screwed it all up, but I still believe in you and I still believe in your messenger. I just want to do it right. And after that, I became much more pragmatic. Like I was just like, whatever works, I'm going with it. So this Quranic translation is meaningful to me. I'm going to use that one. If this book of spirituality hits me, I'm going to use that one. If this dhikr seems meaningful, I'm going to make that one. And I'm going to go to the masjid and I'm going to do stuff. And I'm not going to be too worried about how it all fits together. And in that process, I kind of, became more like more Sufi, you could say, like without following a tariqah or anything, but like, and so I gravitated towards like certain teachers and certain experiences, and so like many people, like I wanted to go, just like for one of the first like paradigmatic moments, I'd wanted to go to Egypt, and I wanted to go to Al-Azhar and everything. So my wife and I went to Egypt and then went for Umrah. I think it was like 2007. And I was praying Maghrib in Al-Azhar. And I just like, when I finished the Maghrib prayer, it was like I started imagining Karbala. And I was just like, whoa, like, how crazy is that? Like, that's so, I just like, yeah, Hussein. Like, I don't think I said that to myself, but I was just like, that. Whew. And then I was like, wait a second, across the street is Sayyidina al-Hussein Masjid. Isn't that what they say where like his head is? I gotta just go over there. So no one had taught me to do like ziyarah at this point.
What brought that thought?
I have no idea. I was just sitting, prayed Maghrib, and I was just like kind of by myself, like inside of the masjid, and I just started thinking about it. And I was like, I gotta go across the street and like find where his tomb is. And so I just like ran across the street, and I was like, went inside and I like looked around and like sort of saw that there was this room over there and it had this like silver metal thing, and I was like, went in there. I didn't know what to do. I didn't like, no one had taught me like to do those sort of things. I went in and kind of just, sat there and meditated for a little bit, and it was very meaningful to me. And I told like one of my Sufi teachers later, later on that this had happened. He was like, Hussein had called to you. That was Hussein calling to you. So like I felt like, oh, wow, okay, because it's a person I respected, saying this sort of thing. And so that was like a more personal thing. On a more like intellectual thing, when I had started in my PhD program, which I just got the master's from at Princeton University, started all the way back in 2002. There was two Shii guys who were finishing the program, Najm Haider, who's now at Barnard College, and Tariq Al-Jamil, who's at Swarthmore. And I went to them, I said, listen, I've never really studied the Shii tradition. Can you guys recommend some books? And one of the books they recommended is Doctrines of Shia Islam by Ayatollah Jafar Subhani. And I got it, and like the hardback version, the original version, which is like, I love that book. And they should reprint the hardback, whoever's watching, please reprint the hardback version of Doctrines of Shia Islam. And I was blown away. Like I was like, it was just so, there was so much in there that just, I was like, wow, it makes so much sense, and it's really like insightful, and there's just, I just remember just being really struck by it. But I didn't have any like Shii communities to go to, and I was kind of just involved in my academic stuff and like on-campus stuff, and so I had like friendship with these Shiis, and asked them questions and stuff. But it wasn't like it was easy plug and play like what to do. So then like forward to like when I was the chaplain at Brown University, 2009 to 2013, like I was very intentionally ecumenical. I was like, any Shiis are going to be like super welcome in this MSA. So I think it was like the first Ramadan, there was one Shii kid from Pakistan. I was like, well, what do you want to do? Like, we during the Taraweeh, I know you don't do that. He was like, oh, we do this thing called Dua Jawsh and Kabir, which is really beautiful. So I like printed out copies of it, and I was like, all right, anyone who wants to come say it, like after we pray Maghrib and have iftar, we're going to go over here and sit in the couches and read some of this together. And so I don't know, we spent 25 minutes reading Dua Jawsh and Kabir together, and it was really beautiful. But he was like totally satisfied with that. He was like, that was amazing, thank you so much. And I was like, never asked for anything again. And there was this African-American Shi who would come to Jummah. So one day I was like, well, can you give the adhan? He's like, are you sure? I was like, yeah, of course. I know what you're going to say. Just you give the adhan. And so he gave the adhan. And then, some people in the congregation were a little confused, but they sort of trusted me and no one hemmed or hawed about it. But again, like he was totally satisfied with that, level of representation. And so even like in, that time, like there was that was it. It was like my effort to like be inclusive, but there was no one on the other side to be like, hey, like, let me tell you what this beautiful tradition is. The way that, for example, like certain, Salafis who had, a nicer understanding of things would to me, or certain, academics that are academics understanding but was still beautiful, or, sort of traditional Sunni Sufis had their perspective. It had all these kind of teachers that had, made it real, but I never had like a Shi teacher. And so I kind of carried that sort of general spirit with me to when I was working at NYU. So when I was at NYU, I was teaching a class on Islamic law and ethics to undergraduates, and then I was sort of like, I wasn't paid by NYU, but I was very close with Imam Khalid Latif, the chaplain there, and so I'd kind of just do whatever I could to support him because we had been chaplain colleagues, when I was working at Brown too. So I would like give khutbahs, and I would do halaqas, and I would meet with kids, and so I was very active in the community and felt, sort of like one of the leaders. And so when they had this program called Muharram in Manhattan that, they had been doing in Manhattan in different places, but this year was going to be happening at NYU, I felt like I should go, like I should be ecumenical, Muslim unity. And it was Sheikh Fayaz Jafar, who's now the Shia chaplain at NYU, who was reciting the Majlis. And there was people doing poetry, in particular, Sister Aqila Naqvi from New Jersey, who does amazing poetry, mashallah. And I was just blown away. I was like, what was that? I was like, so moved. And I went home, I lived just a couple blocks away. I went home and I couldn't sleep that night. And I wrote like a poem about Imam Hussein for the first time. And it was just about, it was basically like asking Imam Hussein for forgiveness for the fact that I had never really understood what had happened to you, and how deeply thankful I am that you like stood true on that day. And I've recited that poem at different majalis and julus and stuff over the years, but it was so spontaneous. Again, it's like, maybe that's the theme of this whole thing, is the spontaneity or the qadr. It was just like that one night, I go and I can't sleep, and then I write this poem, and then I kept writing poems, and I kept going. And so I went back to the majlis. I thought I was going to go one night just to kind of show my face. So I'm like, so glad you're here. We're all one ummah. Peace. Now I'm going to go back to my Sunni Sufi stuff. And I wanted to go back every night. And I remember the night they talked about Ali al-Akbar, man. I was just, it was so powerful, and I was just crying just so hard. And maybe it's because I was a new father, I remember Najm Haider said the power of like the majlis is that it has something for everybody. Like even if it, like he was talking about the Urdu majlis, like the way it weaves and has all these elements to it, like people can find themselves in it. And so maybe that was what was going on. But I just remember it was so deep, And so it became one of those things that I just needed to like follow through. I didn't know I was going to become Shi. I just knew like I needed to like let this sink into my heart and like see where it goes. And so one of the things was like, for example, that I wanted to do ziyarah because I had been to Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Muawiyah in Damascus on ziyarah with like Sufis. And so the fact that I had never been to Imam Ali like really troubled me. But it was like literally I never thought about the fact that I had overlooked him. This is like a classic kind of example of Shi erasure that begins with Imam Ali alayhi salam and Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salam. It's like until that time period, I never dawned on me that I had skipped him over. And so I was like, I have to go to Iraq and I have to visit, Najaf. I have to go to Imam Hussein. I'd been to him in Cairo, again, before I knew any of this stuff, just spontaneously. So I have to go to him in Karbala. So Sheikh Fayaz was like, I'll take you. And, first he went a couple times and I couldn't go. And then he was like, we're going. Can you come? And I was like, yeah, totally, I can come. And it was like me, two Khoja kids from like the New York community, Sheikh Fayaz's wife and his daughter. It was just like us in one small bus. And it was amazing. And, but it was one of those things that was so transformative. Just like other, going on Hajj was transformative, and going on Umrah was transformative, and going on ziyarah to other people, that have had a big impact on the Ummah are transformative. But like this was another level in terms of that idea of the connection to the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. And I remember going, to Najaf, and, I walk up and I got my book and I say my ziyarah at the door, and then I go in and I, say my piece at the dhari, and then I go into the room with all the mirrors where you're supposed to do your 2 rakahs, and I do my 2 rakahs, and just like, boom, like everything I'd ever heard about Imam Ali came like flooding into my mind and my heart, and I was just bawling, and I was just like, I don't know who Imam Ali is, but I'm down here and he's up there, and he will always be up there, and he's just, something else. I remember Sheikh Fayaz always used to use that Quranic rhetoric, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا, in the majalis, he'd be like, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا Ali, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا Hussein. And I was like, it seemed a little much when I first heard it, but I think after that, and so like when I hear like great ulama talking about like, who is Ali? Ali is, Bab Madinat al-Ilm. He's Harun, right? He's all these things that are in hadith, but like, what does that mean, and how do you experience that? And I think it wasn't until I did ziyarah to Najaf that to this day, I don't know who Imam Ali is, let alone the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But it was like, by doing the ziyarah, you get that window into that ocean that you're just standing at the shore of. So there are many, many funny stories. Some of them are a little bit like, inappropriate, but
Too funny.
no, but it's good. I tell people, like, especially with conversion, you have to realize like we had like a whole life that we had before Islam, and it's not like it goes away completely, right? Like we still have those memories, we still have those, inclinations, we still have those connections. Right? So I remember, I'd been Muslim for like a year or two, and I was at Brown University, and we were all hanging out as a like MSA or whatever, and I was just like, I was basically like, I need a cigarette and a cup of coffee. it's like, because that's all I've got. And I was like, and I felt the rush come over me, and all these like kids who had grown up never like once smoke a cigarette, never drank alcohol, like they're just like, who is this like bachara, like you're not bachara, what's the word, but to me is, like inappropriate guy who's like, just smoking his cigarettes and drinking his coffee, like, and I was like, leave me alone. I was like, you don't understand, this is all I got left. This is my halal pleasures. But they were cool about it, you know what I mean? Like it was, but I just remember it so distinctly as like this moment where, it was like trying to reconcile like the world from before and the world of the now, and wanting to do it in front of like my Muslim friends, to like almost like claim like, listen, you don't understand how hard this is for me. Leave me alone. And because I do really believe in that principle of like, if you sin in private, because like there's a certain hurma, there's a certain sanctity to the prohibitions that if like all of a sudden it becomes normalized, you see it, like it happens in society all the time. When a sin becomes normalized and that hurma is removed, then it's just so much easier for people to just fall into it and think it's not a big deal. But if the hurma is there, right? And that means that if you're going to go do it in private and don't talk about it, right? You can talk about it in therapy if you want or with your sheikh, but like don't just be like come out there and say, oh, I did this last night. Like why? Because like it's other people that actually be affected by it. So in this case, it was like, I know coffee's halal, and they say that cigarettes are makruh. So like, no one can give me a hard time about this. You can't amr bil maruf, it's makruh. Oh, I remember I was getting my hair cut with this guy who at Brown University, I think my senior year, and he's got the knife and the scissors in his hand or whatever, and he just starts going off about Muslims. And I was just like, do I tell him or do I not tell him? And I didn't tell him. I was just like, okay, but what about this? Like, maybe you shouldn't think about it that way. But I was like, I don't know how I was going to react if all of a sudden, like, actually, I'm a Muslim. Because he has no clue that I'm a Muslim. I remember there was, like another funny story was, I remember my mother was like really upset at one point, like early on, and she was kind of like, she was really like, she was emotional, and so she was kind of saying anything that came to her mind, and I was kind of just letting her, and she was like, and I'm worried that you're not going to get into the country club because you're a Muslim. and I was like, Mom, I didn't even want to be in the country club before I was Muslim. So I enjoy going and playing golf with you and Dad. This was not one of my life goals, was to get accepted at the right clubs. Well, now the Saudis own golf, so, joke's on them. The Saudis bought golf, American golf, much to the chagrin of many white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from my people, the WASP people. What are some other good ones? Oh, one of the best ones is I go on my first Hajj, and I'm like all excited, like I'm gonna be like in the center of the ummah, and I'm gonna be one of the ummah. So like I get all my Muslim clothes, and that's what I wear. Obviously, like when you're wearing ihram, you're wearing ihram, but like every other time I had these like shukr clothing. Have you ever heard of that brand? Yeah. So like they had a lot of like shukr shirts and shukr kufis and everything. And but then one day we're in Mina, right? So it's like the 11th or 12th of Dhul Hijjah, I can't remember. And I'm like, I'm just gonna go get like a cup of chai. So I'm in our tent area. So I was wearing like a, collared, button down, short sleeve plaid shirt, and then like pants and chappals, sandals. And so I'm like, don't even think about it, no kufi. So I was like reading or something. I'm gonna go get a cup of chai. So I like walk out and I walk for a couple minutes, and this guy comes up to me and he's like, oh my God, are you an American? And I'm like, this is like right like in basically the American tent area, right? Because they cordon it off by nationality. So I'm like, yeah, I'm an American. And he goes, but are you a Muslim? And I was like, it's Mina on Hajj. Like, you have to be Muslim to get here, like, to do all of this. Like, we've already done Hajj. I was like, well, did you think that I just had... And he goes, he's like, no, were you a Muslim before you came here? I was like, wait, are you trying to say that, like, I decided to come on Hajj as a non-Muslim and I was so moved by the experience that I, like, took my Shahada? Like, after we did Arafat, it was so powerful, I had to take my Shahada. Like, what? Like, I was just like, and I remember in that moment, I was like, there is nothing I can do other than wear the outside affect of Islam to ever be like accepted as anything but like a white man. You know what I mean? And that was a real, actually powerful moment, probably part of the reason why I dressed the way I did for this interview. Is it like to just own who you are, right? And it wasn't like I was trying to be someone different by wearing the shukr clothing. That was just what seemed like it would be fun and appropriate to wear when I was in Saudi Arabia for the Hajj. But it was like, at that moment, I realized that me and my natural sort of let your hair down self, they're just going to see me as like blonde-haired, blue-eyed white guy. My hair's not really blonde anymore. It was blonde when I was a kid, I swear. So brown-haired, blue-eyed white guy, and all the assumptions that come along with that. And so, yeah, if I wear a turban and a dishdasha and everything else, and I talk with an accent, and I always quote like a hadith in all of my speech, like then I'll have some sort of like authenticity or legitimacy. But I think in that moment, it was like literally in the middle of Hajj, and like they see me as like white American guy. And so like and I think that was also a big moment for me to realize that the Ummah is not just like one melting pot. It's like a place where people come together with all of their different backgrounds. This person really is Indian, and this person really is Malaysian, and this person really is Egyptian, and I really am American, like culturally. And I'm not Canadian. Those weird people play hockey. We play baseball. They play hockey. They have the Toronto Blue Jays, but like, I'm not British. Those weird people play cricket. We Americans play baseball, San Diego Padres, Oakland A's, so on and so forth. So, it was just one of those moments where you kind of like, I think because you get into the idea that like, I'm just a Muslim and I can travel anywhere in the Ummah, and they'll be like, oh, welcome in, like, have some of our local food and regale us with tales of how you became Muslim. And that's great and wonderful. But if your Islam then can't make you fully you, if it's a kind of clothes you're wearing, it's a performance you're doing, and it doesn't just really come from the most authentic place of you. Like, to me, like, eating a halal hot dog is the same thing as like making my salah, is the same thing as like playing catch with my son out in the backyard, baseball, is the same thing as like reading Quran in English, it's the same thing as reading Quran in Arabic. Like, it's all just me. It's just, I'm not doing Islam when I'm reading the all Arabic Quran and not doing Islam when I'm playing baseball with my son. Like, maybe in Pakistan, like, fathers and sons play cricket together. I don't know, and they have this special moment, and then they go make salah. We play baseball together, then we go make salah. And so, but that takes years.
How many years did it take for you to reach this point?
So, that Hajj was 2005, so I'd been Muslim for 7 years, and that's, I think, the first moment when it really started like clicked. I remember in 2007 giving a talk in New York City at this place called the Mecca Center. I don't know if it's still around, but it was like a center set up for converts, called 9 Years a Muslim, and it was like, or it's called after Shahada, 9 years as a Muslim, and I was like, I don't want to tell the story about me, my Shahada. I want to tell the story about after, how I got to like here where I feel more like centered. And then I think, and this is just like a whole nother conversation we can't really get into, but it's important to say, is that when I was the chaplain at Dartmouth in 2008, 2009, the chaplain at Brown from 2009 to 2013, part of that responsibility was actually being in charge of like large-scale Muslim stuff. So like in Dartmouth, you're basically like the imam for like a 50-mile radius. There's nobody else. And at Brown, because of the role Brown plays in the state of Rhode Island, and because the teacher my first teacher was still the imam of like the central masjid in Providence, I became like the sort of convener. I was involved in like all aspects of Muslim life in Rhode Island. And so once you actually do it, once you kind of get behind the curtain, so to speak, and you have to be the person on point who actually like, leads the prayers, like deals with the community issues, sets up the events, deals with the interpersonal politics, like, basically everything. I basically did everything except like counseling people through their divorces, because I was like, I'm too young and like inexperienced. I have no training for that. So go to the other imams for that. It's just sort of see all aspects of Muslim life in America. At that point, like, you're done. Like you know what it takes to like do everything that you need to do in the United States of America to lead. And that's not everything in Islam, right? Like there are people in positions of great, political responsibility that have to bring their Islam to bear, and we all know like figures that we look up to that, met that challenge. And they were special and did things that probably we could never do if we were put in those positions. But in terms of just the kind of like daily life of like living Islam and practicing Islam in a country where, there is no system like that, at that point you realize like the things you know and the things that you don't know. And it's like, so if I don't know the fiqh question, I'll call, Sayyid Suleiman or call you or whoever it may be. Sheikh Fayaz, ask them, I didn't go to Hausa. I don't know the answer to this question. But like, you know what it takes to actually live Islam in all aspects of your life and how other people need to, bring that taqwa to bear on all aspects of their life. And at that point, you're just off and running, and you either do it or you don't do it. But it's who you are, And so that, was 15 years, right? If you start in 1998 and go to 2013. But I think, so that was so when just to go back to the sheep thing, since we talked a little bit about it, is that when I went to NYU, and I was already living near there, but I, kind of left my job right before my son was born in the end of 2013. He was born in the beginning of 2014. So I was kind of fully invested in NYU. My thought was, okay, well, I'll just do what I need to do to become like a better Sunni imam. Like that was my whole like what am I going to do while I'm not working at Brown anymore and living in New York? I'll do more studies of tafsir or fiqh or I'll tasawwuf or whatever. And it was in that time when all that stuff happened with the majlis. So it was like, I was also realizing that there was this whole aspect of Islam that I had really neglected, right? And that I think that was one of the things that was so powerful about it for me, was because like I had gone through this trajectory and I felt like I know what Islam is and I know how to live it. And now all of a sudden, like from that first majlis to that night, they talked about Allah Akbar, whether it was the 8th or whatever, so I had 8 majlises, and I'm like, I don't know what Islam, like, I feel like I missed something really important about Islam, even though I've had all these experiences. So in a way, it was kind of remarkable, because it was like almost like, again, to this qadr point, like Allah arranged all these things, because it's not like that was all in the plan, but in that moment, when I was ready to hear it, and I was in this space where I was willing to take time away from leading communities, which I had done, and accept the fact that maybe I didn't understand Islam as well as I thought I did. And I also didn't understand the issue of leadership the way that I thought I did. And I think that, there's so much to say about that, but, we don't really have time. But I think that's really important, because like at the end of the day, even when we think back of the story of like how I became Muslim, it was the acknowledgement that Allah is the authority. The acknowledgement that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the authority. So that story I told about like the difficult discipline that I went through in the first couple of years of being Muslim. Right? Why? Because they have authority over my life. They're the ones who get to say you can and cannot do this thing. They're the ones who say stand up or sit down. And I have to be like, Sama'na wa ata'na, we hear and we obey. And so for me, like the concept of authority and how that like goes from like the unseen realm into the world of human history was always like the biggest question I had. And I spent so much, the first 10 years, almost all of my studies were about Islamic political history and Islamic law. And in many respects, that's sort of like I said, when I just kind of went in my personal life, went for, like the things that made sense to me. And I partially did that because it was like I needed that spiritually to reconcile the fact that I wasn't finding the answers on the level of like fiqh and political authority, and then the spirituality needed to come from someplace else. So, another story for another time. In many ways, when I discovered, in the beginning, I would say probably with those majalis and that ziyarah, to Iraq was like the moment when those two streams came back together. And all of a sudden, like Islam was complete and whole in my heart and my mind. And in figures like Imam Ali or, Imam Hussein or Imam as-Sadiq, I felt the fullness of that prophetic presence and that prophetic dispensation in a way that, was integrated and was clear. And I think that had just such a huge impact on like my Islam going forward. But those were things that I had never really reconciled up until that point.